Arrogant millionaire. Put poor woman's home for auction. Her dead husband appeared in auction and changed the game. The gavel's crack echoed through the county courthouse like a gunshot. Sarah Mitchell flinched, her fingers digging crescents into her palms as she watched her world being sold to the highest bidder. Across the polished mahogany table, Maxwell Stone's lips curled into what could only generously be called a smile. A vulture would have shown more compassion. "Do I hear 20,000 over the current bid?" The auctioneer's voice floated above the murmurs of the assembled vultures, real estate developers and investors who smelled blood in the water. Sarah's blood, her family's legacy. The Victorian home on Maple Street wasn't just wood and glass and brick. It was where Thomas had carried her over the threshold, where Emily had taken her first steps across the worn oak floors, where Jack had built pillow forts in the bay window during thunderstorms. It was where Thomas had kissed her goodbye that final morning, his cologne lingering in the air long after the accident that took him from them. "Mom?" Emily's voice trembled beside her, 16 and trying so hard to be strong. Her father's eyes stared back at Sarah from her daughter's face. What are we going to do? What could she do? Sarah's nurse's salary barely covered groceries and utilities, let alone the suddenly ballooned mortgage payments that had appeared after Thomas's death. A convenient loan she'd never known about, with compounding interest rates that defied both logic and the law. "The house is as good as mine," Stone had told her just yesterday, his 6'2" frame blocking the sunlight in her kitchen. "Nothing personal, Mrs. Mitchell, just business. Prime real estate shouldn't be wasted on sentimentality." Now he sat in the front row, designer suit creasing perfectly as he raised his hand again. 200,000, he announced, voice dripping with boredom, as if he were ordering coffee. Sarah's heart constricted. The GoFundMe her hospital colleagues had organized had raised barely 50,000. Mrs. Rodriguez squeezed her hand, the elderly woman's arthritis-swollen fingers surprisingly strong. "That man has the devil in him," she whispered. "Thomas would never have borrowed money from such a snake." Sarah knew she was right. In the 3 years since the accident, she'd learned that her husband, a structural engineer with an unyielding ethical code, had been looking into Stone's development company. Something about safety violations and environmental shortcuts that Thomas couldn't ignore. "Going once at 200,000, the auctioneer called, his eyes scanning the crowd with professional detachment. Before we dive deep into this eye-opening story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's free, as your support helps us create more meaningful stories for you. Enjoy the story. Michael Collins, the public interest attorney who had taken Sarah's case pro bono, shuffled the useless papers before him. All their evidence of document falsification had been dismissed by Judge Harrison, a golf buddy of Stone's. Going twice. A cold draft swept through the room, though the windows were closed against the October chill. The chandelier lights flickered, dimming momentarily before surging back to brightness. And then the heavy oak doors at the back of the courthouse swung open. The man who entered moved with deliberate steps, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a charcoal gray hat. Something in his gait made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Something familiar in the set of his shoulders, the rhythm of his steps. Impossible recognition flooded her veins with ice water. "I bid 250,000. The stranger announced, his voice carrying easily through the suddenly silent room. Maxwell Stone's head snapped around, annoyance flashing across his sculpted features. He gave the newcomer a dismissive glance before raising his hand again. 300,000. 400, the stranger countered without hesitation. A muscle jumped in Stone's jaw. 500,000. 1 million. The stranger stepped forward, moving into the light. Gasps rippled through the courthouse. Sarah's world tilted sideways. She gripped the table edge as the room began to spin. The stranger removed his hat, revealing a face she knew more intimately than her own. A face she'd traced with fingertips in darkness, had watched laugh and cry and age. A face she'd kissed goodbye 3 years ago, never to see again. Thomas. But not Thomas. Her daughter's strangled cry tore through her shock. "Dad!" The Thomas who couldn't be Thomas looked directly at them for the first time, compassion flooding his familiar hazel eyes before turning back to the auctioneer. $1 million, he repeated firmly, and I can transfer the funds immediately. Maxwell Stone shot to his feet, color draining from his face as if he'd seen a ghost. Perhaps he had. "This is irregular," he sputtered, looking to the auctioneer, to his lawyer, to anyone who might help. "Who is this man? He can't just walk in and—" "I believe I can," the stranger said, reaching into his jacket to produce identification. "Timothy Mitchell. And I have as much right to bid as anyone here." Sarah's mind raced. Timothy Mitchell. Thomas had mentioned a twin brother once or twice, estranged years ago after a family argument, working overseas with humanitarian organizations. A brother she'd never met, never seen pictures of, whose existence had faded into the background of their busy lives. $2 million, Stone snapped, composure cracking. Timothy's smile was cold as winter moonlight. $5 million. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible. Stone's face contorted with fury. $10 million, he hissed through clenched teeth. $20 million, Timothy countered smoothly, with immediate payment verification and one additional condition. Stone froze, trapped by his own arrogance and the watching crowd. "What condition?" he asked, voice dangerously low. Timothy Mitchell's eyes never left Stone's face as he spoke. "That Mr. Stone explains to this court exactly how he came to possess loan documents signed by my brother 3 months after his death." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Judge Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly, the sound lost in the surge of voices. Sarah felt the floor beneath her shift, reality bending as Timothy, this ghost wearing her husband's face, produced a leather portfolio. "I have evidence," he announced, voice cutting through the din like a scalpel, "that will interest not only this court, but also the FBI agents present today." As if summoned by his words, a woman in the third row stood up, badge already in hand. "Special Agent Diane Foster, FBI," she called out, her authoritative tone silencing the room instantly. "This auction is now part of an ongoing federal investigation." Maxwell Stone's face cycled through shock, disbelief, and finally, a calculating calm that chilled Sarah to the bone. She'd seen that look before, on Predators Cornered but still dangerous. "This is absurd," Stone declared, straightening his Italian silk tie with manicured fingers. "I don't know who this man is or what game he's playing, but these accusations are patently false." Timothy's laugh was so achingly familiar that tears sprang to Sarah's eyes, that same low chuckle that had once vibrated against her cheek when they lay together in bed. "Really, Mr. Stone? False? Then perhaps you can explain why my brother's signature appears on loan documents dated March 14th, when police and medical records confirm he died on January 8th. He stepped closer to Stone, and Sarah saw sweat beading at the millionaire's hairline. "Or maybe you'd like to explain the unusual brake failure on my brother's car. The mechanic found it strange that the brake line appeared to have been cleanly cut." Stone's eyes darted toward the exit, calculating distances and probabilities. His attorney, Elizabeth Crane, elegant in her tailored suit, had gone completely still, her face a perfect mask of professional neutrality even as her eyes betrayed mounting panic. "These are serious accusations," Judge Harrison interjected, his earlier favoritism toward Stone notably absent. "Agent Foster, is the court to understand federal authorities are involved?" "Yes, Your Honor," Foster replied, other agents now revealing themselves throughout the courtroom. "We've been investigating Mr. Stone's business practices for some time. The Mitchell property became relevant when we discovered evidence suggesting Thomas Mitchell's death may not have been accidental." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She'd always sensed something wrong about the accident. Thomas had been meticulous about car maintenance, but to hear it confirmed, to know he might have been murdered. Her chest constricted painfully, the world narrowing to a pinpoint of white-hot grief. Emily's hand found hers, squeezing so hard it hurt. "Mom," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "Did they kill Dad?" Before Sarah could answer, Stone made his move, lunging toward a side door. He made it 3 steps before 2 agents intercepted him, the takedown swift and professional. The click of handcuffs echoed in the suddenly silent room. "Maxwell Stone," Agent Foster announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and as a person of interest in the death of Thomas Mitchell." As Stone was led away, spitting threats and demands for his lawyer, Sarah finally found the strength to stand. Her legs trembled beneath her as she approached Timothy, this stranger with her husband's face, this man who had stepped from nowhere to save everything. "Who are you?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Really?" His eyes, Thomas's eyes, softened with compassion. "I'm exactly who I said. Timothy Mitchell, Thomas's twin brother." He glanced around at the dispersing crowd, the agents collecting evidence. "Is there somewhere we could talk, privately? There's so much to explain." Minutes later, they sat in a small conference room off the main courthouse. Emily and Jack pressed close to Sarah's sides like frightened children, though at 16 and 12 they tried to project bravery. Mrs. Rodriguez and Michael Collins stood sentinel by the door, protective. Timothy's hands, so like Thomas's but with different calluses, different scars, wrapped around a paper cup of courthouse vending machine coffee. "I was in Burundi when Thomas died," he began, voice rough with emotion. "We hadn't spoken in years. A stupid argument about our parents' estate. I was stubborn. He was stubborn." He shook his head, regret etching lines around his eyes. "I found out about his death 6 months later when I finally returned to civilization and checked my messages." "Why didn't you contact us then?" Sarah asked, struggling to reconcile this man with the vague mentions Thomas had made of his estranged brother. "I tried," Timothy replied. "But when I started making inquiries, I discovered things that didn't add up. Thomas's projects, the timing of his accident, the sudden financial troubles you were experiencing." His jaw tightened. "I'm a doctor, but before that, I was military intelligence. Something felt wrong, so I started digging, and the deeper I dug, the more convinced I became that Thomas's death wasn't an accident." Jack, quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. "Is that why weird things keep happening at our house? The lights flickering? Dad's cologne smell coming out of nowhere?" Timothy's expression softened. "I don't know, buddy. Maybe your dad's been watching over you all this time." Sarah hardly dared to ask her next question. "How did you know about the auction?" "About Stone?" "I've been working with the FBI for months," he answered. "We needed Stone to make a move that would expose his entire operation. The auction was perfect, public, documented with multiple witnesses." His expression hardened. "What I didn't expect was for him to push the price so high. He must have really wanted your land." "But you stopped him," Emily said, something like hope flickering in her eyes for the first time in years. "You really have $20 million?" Timothy's laugh, not quite Thomas's, but close enough to make Sarah's heart twist, filled the small room. Number. But the F. BI does, for operations like this. Stone took the bait. He's exposed now, and with the evidence we've gathered, he'll be facing federal charges. The reality of what had just occurred began to sink in, washing over Sarah in alternating waves of relief and disbelief. Her home, their home, was safe, but at what cost? The revelation that Thomas's death might have been murder opened a chasm of questions that yawned dark and bottomless before her. "I need to know everything," Sarah said, her nurse's training taking over, compartmentalizing emotion to deal with the emergency at hand. Not just the legal implications, but why. Why Thomas? Why us? Timothy exchanged glances with Agent Foster, who had joined them in the conference room. Foster nodded almost imperceptibly. Permission granted. Thomas was working on structural assessments for Stone's Riverfront Plaza project, Timothy began, pulling documents from his portfolio and spreading them on the table. What he found disturbed him. Substandard materials, ignored safety protocols, environmental impact reports that were falsified. Michael leaned forward, attorney's eyes scanning the paperwork. These are the same issues I've been trying to prove for my class action clients. Former Stone construction employees who were fired after raising safety concerns. Thomas documented everything, Timothy continued. He was building a case to present to the authorities. According to emails we recovered, he confronted Stone 3 days before his accident. The word accident hung in the air, stripped now of its innocence. Sarah closed her eyes, imagining Thomas, principled, uncompromising Thomas, standing his ground against a man like Stone. The brake lines, she whispered, forcing herself to say it aloud. They were cut. Foster stepped forward, her professional demeanor softening slightly. The evidence suggests tampering. We've reopened the investigation into your husband's death as a potential homicide. Emily made a strangled sound beside her, halfway between a gasp and a sob. Sarah wrapped an arm around her daughter's trembling shoulders, drawing her close. And after he was gone, Sarah continued, the pieces falling into terrible alignment. Stone fabricated loan documents to force us out of our home. But why? Why target us specifically? Timothy slid another document across the table, a survey map with their property highlighted in red. Your house sits on the last parcel Stone needs to complete his development. Without it, the whole project collapses. The City Council's approval was contingent on the entire block being redeveloped. So Thomas refuses to be bought, discovers Stone's illegal activities, threatens to expose him. Sarah traced the logical progression, each step more horrifying than the last. And Stone has him killed, then manufactures a financial crisis to force us out anyway. Yes, Foster confirmed, her voice hard with contained fury. And he might have succeeded if Timothy hadn't contacted us 6 months ago with his suspicions. Jack, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly asked, "What happens to Mr. Stone now?" The bluntness of the question, delivered in his still childish voice, stabbed at Sarah's heart. Her 12-year-old son shouldn't have to ask about the punishment for his father's murderer. He'll be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, Foster assured him. The evidence we've gathered today, combined with Timothy's documentation and testimony from Stone's associates who are already cooperating, makes for an extremely strong case. Elizabeth Crane, Timothy added. Stone's attorney. She's already negotiating a deal in exchange for testimony. A sharp rap at the door interrupted them. Another agent entered, leaning close to Foster to whisper something. Foster's expression tightened. "Stone is demanding to speak with you, Mrs. Mitchell," she said. "Obviously, you're under no obligation to—" "I want to see him," Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I need to look him in the eye." "Sarah, no," Michael objected immediately. "Legally speaking, this is a terrible idea. Anything you say could—" "I don't care about legal implications," Sarah cut him off, a cold certainty settling in her bones. "This man may have murdered my husband and tried to steal our home. I need to face him." Timothy studied her with Thomas's eyes, seeing perhaps some of the steel that had first attracted his brother. "I understand," he said quietly, "but you shouldn't go alone." 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself in a small holding room, the institutional green walls closing in around her. Maxwell Stone sat across the metal table, his hands cuffed before him, the perfect coif of his hair now disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled. Only his eyes remained unchanged, calculating, cold, assessing her for weaknesses. Mrs. Mitchell, he acknowledged, his voice still carrying that infuriating tone of superiority. Come to gloat? No, Sarah replied, forcing herself to meet his gaze steadily. I came to understand. Stone's laugh was brittle. Understand what? Business? The real world? Your husband didn't understand either. He thought his principles were more important than progress. They were. Sarah leaned forward slightly. They are. Charming, Stone sneered. And now his long-lost brother appears like a deus ex machina to save the day. How convenient. Sarah felt Timothy stiffen beside her but kept her focus on Stone. Did you kill my husband? The bluntness of the question seemed to catch even Stone off guard. A fleeting expression, something almost like respect, crossed his face before the mask of arrogance returned. I don't know what you're talking about, he replied smoothly. Thomas Mitchell died in a tragic accident. If certain parties are suggesting otherwise, they'll find such allegations extremely difficult to prove. We have the mechanic who falsified the inspection report, Timothy said quietly, and the former employee who witnessed you giving orders to take care of the Mitchell problem. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Stone's eyes, quickly replaced by calculating assessment, hearsay and circumstantial evidence. My attorneys will tear it apart. Maybe, Sarah acknowledged, her heart pounding so hard she was certain they could hear it, but everyone will know what you did. Your reputation, your legacy, your freedom, gone. Stone leaned forward, his cuffed hands clinking against the table. What do you want, Mrs. Mitchell? Money? An apology? What makes this go away? The audacity of the question stole Sarah's breath. The man who had potentially murdered her husband, who had tried to steal their home, who had terrorized her family for months, was trying to negotiate as if this were merely another business deal. Justice, she answered simply, rising to her feet. Nothing more, nothing less. As she turned to leave, Stone called after her, desperation finally cracking his polished veneer. You don't understand what you're doing. I have connections. This isn't over. Sarah paused at the door, looking back one last time at the man whose greed had shattered her world. It was over the moment you targeted my family. Outside in the corridor, Sarah's composure finally cracked. Her knees buckled and Timothy caught her elbow, his steadying grip achingly familiar, yet foreign. They found a quiet alcove where she could gather herself, away from the bustling courthouse activity. How did you do it? She asked finally, wiping away tears with trembling fingers. How did you find all this evidence when the police couldn't? Timothy's smile held a shadow of sadness. The police weren't looking for murder, Sarah. They saw a tragic accident. But I knew my brother. Thomas was meticulous, especially about his car. He would never have missed a maintenance issue that serious. He hesitated, then added, and Thomas had a backup plan. He sent me an encrypted email the day before he died. I didn't see it until months later, but it contained copies of everything he'd found on Stone. Insurance, he called it. Even estranged, he trusted you, Sarah whispered, the irony piercing her heart. We may have been angry with each other, but we were still brothers. Timothy's voice roughened. I wish I'd answered his calls. Maybe if I had. Sarah laid her hand on his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath the fabric of his jacket. Don't. I've spent 3 years torturing myself with what-ifs. It doesn't help. Their eyes met, a current of shared grief passing between them. For a moment, it was almost like looking at Thomas again, but different. The same features arranged with subtle variations, like a familiar piece of music played in a different key. Mom? Emily's voice broke the moment. She stood in the doorway, Jack at her side, their faces tight with uncertainty. They said, we can go home now. Home. The word resonated with new meaning. Their home was safe, tainted by new knowledge perhaps, but still theirs. Agent Foster wants us back tomorrow for formal statements, Michael added, joining them with a stack of paperwork. But the auction has been officially nullified. Stone's freeze on your accounts has been lifted, too. You should have access to your funds again by morning. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared, her dark eyes gleaming with satisfaction. I knew it, she declared, patting Sarah's arm. I told you Thomas was watching over you. Even from heaven, he found a way. Timothy cleared his throat. Actually, Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm very much alive, just Thomas's twin brother. The elderly woman eyed him knowingly. Maybe. Or maybe angels take familiar forms when they come to help us. She made a small sign of the cross and shuffled away, leaving Timothy looking bemused. She's been my rock through all of this, Sarah explained. She was there the morning of Thomas's, the morning it happened. She brought us casseroles for weeks afterward. The ride home was surreal. Timothy followed in his rental car, the black sedan trailing them like a protective shadow. Their Victorian house came into view, its gabled roof and wraparound porch a welcome sight after the tension of the courthouse. Will you come in? Sarah asked Timothy as they stood in the driveway, the autumn wind whipping leaves around their feet. He hesitated. Are you sure? It's been an overwhelming day. Emily approached, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill. Please come in, she said quietly. You look so much like him. Like Dad. I want to hear about when you were kids. How could he refuse? Sarah watched as Timothy's resistance melted under her daughter's gaze, those same Mitchell eyes that Thomas had passed to their firstborn. Inside, the house welcomed them with familiar creaks and sighs. Sarah moved through the rooms, turning on lamps against the gathering dusk, hyper-aware of Timothy's presence. He stood in the living room, taking in the family photos on the mantel, the worn leather sofa where Thomas had read bedtime stories, the scratches on the hardwood where they'd dragged the Christmas tree each year. You've kept it exactly as I remember from his photos, Timothy said softly. You've never been here before, Jack asked, trailing Timothy like a curious shadow. Timothy shook his head. Your dad and we lost touch before he and your mom bought this place. The last time I saw him was at our parents' funeral, almost 15 years ago. What happened between you? Sarah asked, the question that had lingered since his appearance at the courthouse finally emerging. Thomas rarely talked about it. Timothy's expression clouded. Pride. Stubborn, foolish pride on both sides. Our parents left the family business to both of us, but we had different visions for its future. Things were said that shouldn't have been. Then I joined Doctors Without Borders, went overseas, and... He spread his hands in a helpless gesture. Years passed. The longer we went without speaking, the harder it became to break the silence. The raw regret in his voice moved something in Sarah's chest. How many times had Thomas picked up the phone, stared at it, then set it down again without making the call? How many times had he mentioned his brother with that same mixture of pride and sorrow? He missed you, she said simply. He kept track of your work. The humanitarian award you received in Geneva. He framed the newspaper article. Timothy's eyes widened. He did? It's in his study, Emily confirmed. I'll show you. As Emily led Timothy away, Jack tugged at Sarah's sleeve. Mom, he whispered, is Uncle Timothy going to stay with us now? The question caught her off guard. I don't know, sweetheart. He has his own life, his own work. But he saved our house, and he looks like Dad, and... Jack's voice dropped even lower. Maybe he's the one who's been making Dad's cologne smell appear. Maybe he's been watching over us all along, like Mrs. Rodriguez said. Sarah knelt before her son, smoothing his unruly hair. Timothy didn't make that happen, Jack. But sometimes... She struggled to find words that wouldn't dismiss his experience while remaining truthful. Sometimes the people we love find ways to remind us they're still with us, even if we can't see them. Jack seemed to consider this, his young face serious. "Do you think Dad knows Uncle Timothy is here? Do you think he's happy?" "Yes," Sarah answered, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I think your dad is very happy right now." In Thomas's study, time seemed suspended. Books still lined the built-in shelves, his reading glasses still perched on the desk where he'd left them. Sarah rarely entered this room. It held too many ghosts, too many fragments of the life they'd lost. Now, watching Timothy trace his fingers over Thomas's engineering awards, the old pain resurfaced like a physical wound. "He kept everything," Timothy murmured, pausing before a framed photograph. Two identical boys, maybe 10 years old, arms slung around each other's shoulders, gap-toothed grins stretched wide. God, I haven't seen this in decades. Emily stood beside him, her resemblance to Thomas striking in profile. "Dad used to talk about the treehouse you built together. He said you were the visionary and he was the engineer, even back then." Timothy's laugh caught on something like a sob. "That old death trap? I'm surprised our parents didn't have heart attacks. I designed it with a zipline exit, and Thomas figured out how to make it structurally sound enough that we didn't break our necks." "That sounds exactly like Dad," Emily said, a genuine smile breaking through her grief for the first time. Sarah watched from the doorway, conflicting emotions tangling in her chest. There was something both healing and painful about Timothy's presence, like pressing on a bruise to feel the strange satisfaction of the ache. "I found something else," Timothy said, pulling a slim file from his briefcase. In Thomas's emails, he was working on a new patent, something about earthquake-resistant foundation systems. Sarah nodded. His passion project. He was always tinkering with it on weekends. "It's brilliant work," Timothy said, spreading the diagrams across the desk. "Revolutionary, even, and completely finished. He was just days away from filing the patent application when he died." The unspoken words hung heavy between them. "Why didn't you file it, Mom?" Emily asked. "You always said Dad's work was important." "I tried," Sarah admitted, "but then the mortgage issues started, and Stone's lawyers began circling. Every engineering firm I approached mysteriously lost interest after initial meetings." Her hands clenched involuntarily. "Now I understand why." Timothy's expression hardened. "Stone. Of course. He wasn't just after your house. He wanted Thomas's work buried." He carefully refolded the plans. "This patent could be worth millions, especially to construction companies working in seismic zones. It's another motive." A sharp knock at the front door startled them. Sarah tensed, months of harassment from Stone's representatives leaving her wary of unexpected visitors. "I'll get it," Jack called from the living room before anyone could stop him. Sarah hurried after him, Timothy close behind. But instead of some threatening legal messenger, Agent Foster stood on their porch, her expression grave. "Mrs. Mitchell, I apologize for the intrusion, but there's been a development." Foster's eyes flicked to Timothy. "We need to talk, all of you." Inside, Foster declined offers of coffee or tea, her urgency palpable. Stone made his one phone call to an overseas number. We traced it to a known associate with connections to both corporate espionage and contract violence. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you saying?" "We believe Stone has activated some sort of contingency plan. Shortly after this call, we intercepted communication suggesting a possible threat against your family." Foster's tone was professionally controlled, but her eyes conveyed the gravity of the situation. "We're here to relocate you to a secure location until we can neutralize the threat." "A safe house?" Timothy asked, instantly shifting into what Sarah recognized as crisis mode, the same focused intensity Thomas would show during emergencies. "Yes," Foster confirmed. "We have agents outside already. We need to move quickly and quietly." Emily clutched Sarah's arm. "Mom, is this real?" Before Sarah could answer, the lights throughout the house cut out, plunging them into darkness. Jack's frightened cry came from somewhere near the staircase. "Everyone down," Foster commanded, drawing her weapon in one fluid motion. Timothy was already moving, pulling Sarah and Emily to the floor behind the sofa. "Jack," he called urgently, "crawl to us now." "What's happening?" Sarah gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Standard intimidation tactic," Foster whispered, her silhouette barely visible against the windows. "Cut power, isolate the target, create panic." A beam of light swept across the front of the house, headlights moving slowly down the street. "Mom!" Jack's voice trembled as he crawled toward them. "I'm scared." "It's okay, buddy," Timothy reassured him, reaching out to pull the boy into their huddle. "Remember what you said about your dad watching over us? I think he still is." As if in response to his words, the scent of Thomas's cologne suddenly filled the air around them, that distinctive blend of pine and cedar that had been mysteriously appearing for months. Sarah felt goosebumps rise along her arms. "Do you smell that?" Emily whispered. Even Foster noticed, her head turning slightly. "What is that?" Before anyone could respond, a thunderous crash came from the kitchen, the sound of the back door being forced open. Foster spoke urgently into her radio, calling for backup, but her words were drowned out by heavy footsteps moving through the house. "They're inside," Timothy mouthed silently, positioning himself protectively in front of Sarah and the children. In the darkness, Sarah fumbled for something, anything, to use as a weapon, her fingers closing around a heavy crystal paperweight from the coffee table. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the beam of a flashlight sweeping methodically through the rooms. Then, in an inexplicable moment that Sarah would replay in her mind for years to come, every light in the house suddenly blazed on at once, momentarily blinding them all. Through the spots dancing in her vision, Sarah saw a man in dark clothing freeze in the doorway, a weapon half raised. Foster was already moving, her gun trained on the intruder, but before she could act, something even more unexpected happened. The grandfather clock in the corner, Thomas's pride and joy, a family heirloom that had never worked properly, began to chime loudly, startling the intruder just long enough for Foster to tackle him to the ground. The front door burst open as FBI agents rushed in, securing the scene with practiced efficiency. Sarah clutched her children close, Timothy's arm a solid barrier before them, as chaos erupted around them. "Clear!" voices called from various parts of the house. "Suspects secured." When it was over, when the handcuffed man had been led away and agents were taking their statements, Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at the front door in her bathrobe, having witnessed the commotion from across the street. "I told you," she said to Sarah, her eyes bright with vindication. "Thomas is still protecting his family." Timothy, overhearing, gave Sarah a questioning look. "The clock," Sarah explained in a shaking voice. "It hasn't worked since Thomas died. He was always tinkering with it, but he never could get it to run consistently. And the power, how did the lights come back on?" Foster approached, holstering her weapon. "Backup generator probably kicked in. As for the clock," she shrugged. "Old mechanics can be unpredictable." But Sarah caught the uncertainty in her eyes, the way Foster glanced at the still-chiming clock with professional suspicion. Later that night, bundled into FBI vehicles with only hastily packed overnight bags, the Mitchell family was escorted to a nondescript suburban safe house on the outskirts of the city. The adrenaline that had sustained Sarah through the home invasion was beginning to ebb, leaving her exhausted yet hyper-alert, jumping at every unfamiliar sound in the unfamiliar house. "Try to get some rest," Agent Foster advised before departing, leaving 2 agents stationed outside. "We've apprehended 1 suspect, but until we're certain Stone's network has been completely neutralized, you'll stay here under protection." Timothy had insisted on staying with them, setting up a makeshift bed on the living room sofa after helping Jack and Emily settle into the safe house's sparse bedrooms. Sarah found him there now, poring over files spread across the coffee table, his brow furrowed in concentration just like Thomas's used to do when solving a particularly complex problem. "You should sleep too," she said softly, offering him a mug of tea from the safe house's meager provisions. He accepted it with a grateful nod. "I will, just trying to piece everything together." He tapped a document, a spreadsheet of Stone Construction financial records. Stone was nearly bankrupt. The riverfront project wasn't just his next development, it was his company's last chance at survival. Sarah sank onto the chair opposite him. So it wasn't just about Thomas's patent or our property. It was about everything. The patent could have saved his company with the right licensing deals. Your land was the linchpin for the development. And Thomas. Timothy's voice hardened. Thomas was the one man who could expose it all. "Perfect storm," Sarah murmured, wrapping her hands around her own mug, seeking warmth against the chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "The man they caught tonight," Timothy continued, "isn't talking, but his phone contained communications that implicate Stone directly in Thomas's death." He hesitated. "Sarah, I think they have enough to charge Stone with murder." The words hung in the air between them. Murder. Not accident, not tragedy. Murder. The confirmation of her worst fears should have devastated her, but instead, Sarah felt an odd sense of clarity, as if a fog had finally lifted. "I suspected," she admitted quietly, "deep down." "Thomas called me that day, hours before the accident. He said he'd discovered something serious that we might need to consider moving away for a while. He sounded worried, not for himself, but for us." Her voice caught. "I told him he was being dramatic." "You couldn't have known," Timothy said gently. "Couldn't I?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. 15 years of marriage, and I dismissed his concerns like they were nothing. If I'd listened— "Stop." Timothy moved to kneel before her, taking her trembling hands in his. "Sarah, look at me. Thomas made his own choices. He confronted Stone directly instead of going straight to the authorities. He didn't tell you the full extent of the danger. And Stone is the only one truly responsible for what happened." His face, so like Thomas's yet distinctly his own, was fierce with conviction. Sarah found herself drawing strength from his certainty, from the solid warmth of his hands around hers. A small noise at the hallway entrance broke the moment. Emily stood there in oversized pajamas, her face pale in the dim light. "I can't sleep," she confessed. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that man in our house with a gun." Sarah opened her arms, and Emily crossed the room to curl against her side like she used to as a little girl. Timothy returned to his spot on the sofa, giving them space while remaining a reassuring presence. "Do you think it's over now?" Emily asked into the quiet. "Really, over?" "Almost," Timothy answered before Sarah could find the words. "Stone's operation is unraveling. His associates are turning on him to save themselves. By this time tomorrow the threat should be neutralized." "And then what?" Emily persisted. "We just go back to normal? Pretend none of this happened?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable. What was normal now? Their home was safe, but violated. Thomas's death had new meaning, new pain attached to it. And Timothy. Where did he fit in whatever came next? "We don't go back," Sarah finally said. "We go forward, with the truth, painful as it is." Morning brought Agent Foster with news. Elizabeth Crane had turned state's evidence, providing detailed testimony about Stone's criminal enterprises, including a recording of Stone explicitly ordering Thomas's problem to be permanently solved. "He'll be charged with first-degree murder," Foster explained as they gathered around the safe house's kitchen table. "Along with fraud, extortion, attempted murder for last night's attack, and a dozen other charges. He won't see freedom again in his lifetime." "What about the man who tampered with Thomas's car?" Sarah asked, carefully choosing her words with the children present. In custody as of an hour ago, Foster confirmed. Stone kept excellent records of his illegal payments. Not so smart for a criminal, but very helpful for us. Jack, who had been quietly pushing cereal around his bowl, suddenly looked up. Does that mean we can go home now? Foster's expression softened. Soon. We're still tracking down one last associate. By tonight, I expect you'll be cleared to return. True to her word, as evening approached, Foster returned to escort them home personally. The autumn sun was setting as they pulled into their driveway, bathing the Victorian house in golden light. FBI technicians had repaired the broken back door and restored the security system, now upgraded with additional features courtesy of the federal government. We'll maintain surveillance for a few more days, Foster assured them, but the immediate threat has been neutralized. Stone and his key associates are in custody without bail. Standing on her porch, watching the FBI vehicles depart, Sarah felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. They had survived. They had won. Justice for Thomas was finally within reach. Timothy lingered awkwardly by his rental car. I should find a hotel, he said. Give you all some space to readjust. No? Sarah surprised herself with the swiftness of her response. Stay, please, at least for tonight. Emily and Jack added their pleas, and Timothy relented with a grateful smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sarah recognized his expression, the look of a man preparing himself for yet another goodbye. That night, after the children had finally fallen asleep in their own beds, Sarah found Timothy on the back porch, staring up at the star-filled sky. Thank you, she said simply, joining him at the railing. Not just for saving our home, but for giving us the truth, for giving Thomas justice. Timothy nodded, his profile sharp against the darkness. I keep thinking about that last email he sent me. If I'd checked my messages sooner, if I hadn't been so stubborn about our stupid feud. He trailed off, shaking his head. Too many regrets. I understand regrets, Sarah said softly, but someone wise recently told me that we can't go back, only forward. That drew a smile from him, a real one this time. They stood in companionable silence, the night wrapping around them like a blanket, until Timothy finally spoke again. I'm due back in Sudan next month. There's a medical crisis that needs... You're leaving. It wasn't a question. My work there isn't finished, he said quietly. But I've been thinking. Boston has some excellent hospitals. When my current contract ends in 6 months, maybe I could look into positions here. Be part of Emily and Jack's lives, if that's something you'd be open to. The offer hung between them, delicate as blown glass. Sarah considered it. The complicated emotions Timothy's presence evoked. The echoes of Thomas, yes, but also something entirely his own. Companionship, understanding, possibility. They would like that, she said carefully. We all would. Something shifted in Timothy's expression. Hope, perhaps, or relief. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. His touch was different from Thomas's. The calluses in different places, the pressure slightly firmer, yet somehow right in its own way. Sarah, he began, then hesitated. I don't want to replace him. I couldn't, even if I tried. I know, she whispered. No one ever could. As if acknowledging their conversation, a gentle breeze stirred the wind chimes Thomas had hung years ago, their crystalline notes drifting through the night air. Sarah and Timothy both looked up at the sound, a shared smile of recognition passing between them. He's still here, Sarah said softly. In the house he loved, in the children's faces, in all the little things he built with his hands. He always was better at building things that last, Timothy agreed, his voice rough with emotion. Even when we were kids, my creations were always flashy but temporary. Thomas built for permanence. Like us, Sarah murmured, the realization crystallizing as she spoke it. Our family. He built it to withstand anything." They fell silent again, the comfortable kind that requires no words to fill it. The night wrapped around them, the stars overhead a silent witness to this fragile new beginning. Morning brought a flurry of activity. Jack had school, his first day back since the auction and subsequent events. Emily was meeting with her guidance counselor to discuss the classes she'd missed, and Sarah was returning to the hospital for her nursing shift, determined to reclaim some normalcy despite Foster's suggestion that she take more time off. Timothy had offered to drive Jack to school, giving Sarah a few precious extra minutes to prepare for her day. Watching them together from the kitchen window, Timothy patiently listening to Jack's animated explanation of some video game, so like Thomas yet distinctly himself, Sarah felt a complicated knot of emotions she couldn't quite untangle. "Mom?" Emily appeared beside her, already dressed for school in jeans and a sweater that had been Thomas's favorite. "Is Uncle Timothy really going back to Africa?" Sarah nodded. "His work there is important. People depend on him." "But he said he might come back, move to Boston." Emily studied her mother's face carefully. "Would that be weird for you, having Dad's identical twin around?" Leave it to a 16-year-old to cut straight to the heart of the matter. Sarah considered her answer carefully. "At first, maybe," she admitted, "but Timothy is his own person. The more time we spend with him, the more obvious the differences become." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "I like having him here. It's like having a piece of Dad back, but not in a sad way, in a way that helps us remember the good stuff." "That's a beautiful way to put it," Sarah said, touched by her daughter's insight. The front door opened and Timothy called out, "Jack's safely delivered to school, complete with his science project that we rescued from the back seat." Sarah smiled. Thomas had always forgotten things in the car, too. Later that afternoon, Agent Foster arrived with final paperwork and news about the case against Stone. "The district attorney is confident," she explained as they sat in the living room. "With Crane's testimony and the evidence Timothy provided, they're not even offering a plea deal. They want the maximum sentence." "Will we have to testify?" Sarah asked, thinking of Emily and Jack having to relive their trauma in a courtroom. "Possibly, but we'll try to minimize your children's involvement." Foster hesitated, then added, "There's something else. Thomas's patent, the foundation system. Our financial crimes team discovered Stone had already begun incorporating elements of it into his designs without attribution. We've frozen those projects pending legal resolution." Timothy leaned forward. "The patent belongs to Sarah and the kids. Thomas's intellectual property should be part of his estate." "It is," Foster confirmed, "and several major construction firms have already expressed interest in licensing it legitimately. Your attorney should prepare for those discussions." After Foster left, Sarah found herself standing in Thomas's study again, looking at the framed engineering diagrams he'd been so proud of. His legacy would live on not just in their memories, but in buildings that would stand for generations, keeping people safe during earthquakes. "He would have been pleased," Timothy said from the doorway, watching her. "Not about the money, but about the lives his work will save." "I know," Sarah replied softly. "That was always what mattered most to him." The week passed in a blur of statements to federal prosecutors, meetings with their attorney about the patent licensing, and attempts to restore routine to their disrupted lives. Through it all, Timothy remained, his presence a stabilizing force as they navigated this new reality. On his last night before departing for Sudan, they held a small dinner party. Mrs. Rodriguez brought her famous paella. Michael Collins came with news that the class action lawsuit against Stone Construction was being settled favorably for the former employees. Even Agent Foster stopped by briefly, bringing a bottle of sparkling cider and the news that Stone's preliminary hearing had gone exactly as they'd hoped. No bail, all charges proceeding to trial. As the evening wound down, the children reluctantly went to bed, extracting multiple promises from Timothy about video calls and his return in 6 months. Mrs. Rodriguez hugged him fiercely, whispering something in his ear that made him both laugh and blink back tears. Finally, it was just Sarah and Timothy on the porch again, the autumn night cool around them. 6 months, Sarah said. It sounds both very long and very short. Timothy nodded. I've arranged for frequent leave to visit, and after my contract ends. He trailed off, leaving the possibility open between them. We'll be here, Sarah assured him. The children already adore their uncle. And their mother? Timothy asked softly, the question gentle without pressure or expectation. Sarah considered this man who had crashed into their lives like a thunderbolt, who wore her husband's face but carried his own soul, who had saved their home, helped bring Thomas's killer to justice, and shown her family that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. Their mother is grateful, she began carefully, and values your friendship more than she can say. The rest— She met his eyes steadily. The rest we'll figure out one day at a time. When you come back. Timothy's smile held understanding, patience, and something that might, with time and care, grow into more. One day at a time, he agreed, reaching out to squeeze her hand briefly. Thomas always said you were the wisest person he knew. A familiar scent drifted between them. Pine and cedar, there and gone in an instant. They both noticed it, exchanging a look of wonder and acceptance. He approves, I think, Timothy said softly. He would want us all to be happy, Sarah agreed. That's what he lived for. The next morning, as Timothy's taxi pulled away from the curb, Sarah stood with her children on the porch of the home they had nearly lost, now safe and filled with new possibilities. The autumn sun caught the stained glass window that Thomas had installed when they first bought the house, sending prisms of colored light dancing across the porch steps. Look, Jack whispered, pointing to the rainbow patterns. Dad's saying goodbye to Uncle Timothy. Sarah wrapped her arms around her children, her heart full. Not goodbye, she corrected gently. Just see you soon. In the months that followed, as Stone's trial progressed and normal life gradually resumed, the Mitchell home remained safe. A sanctuary built on Thomas's love, protected by his foresight, and now expanding to include the brother he'd never stopped loving. Just as he had designed his buildings to withstand earthquakes, Thomas had built a family strong enough to weather even the most devastating storms, emerging not just intact, but stronger for having been tested. And sometimes, in quiet moments when the house creaked and settled, when the scent of pine and cedar drifted through rooms where no cologne bottle existed, Sarah would smile and whisper a thank you to the man who had loved them enough to find a way to protect them, even beyond death itself. Not an ending, but a new beginning. Not a goodbye, but a transformation. And always, always, love that outlasted everything, even time itself. Don't forget to like this video if you believe in the power of love to break down walls and bridge any divide. Please do comment your feedback and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of family, redemption, and the triumph of love over pride. Remember, it's never too late to change your story.